Hi. I just wanted to give you a quick lecture about only approved Indians can play so that you have some ideas about what you might want to write about. So when we read this piece, we have two groups who are playing what's called res ball, which is a basketball. It's a type of basketball played among Native Americans. And if you look in the information I gave you as context, you can find a great video on res ball. All right, so what's going on is we have the Great Lakes team, who are a team mostly from the Canadian border, from the north, and we have a team that's from the Tucson Intertribal House, and Tucson is the name of a city in Arizona. So we know that these are Western Indians, and they're probably from the border region of Mexico. Okay, so what is the significance of this? Well, the Indians who are from the Tucson Intertribal House and who the narrator is really identifying with and trying to push you towards supporting are Indians that have kept their tradition and their languages, mostly because they didn't have a lot of pressure to integrate with Western peoples. They were able to remain independent, and they didn't have to adopt English or the traditions of the West in order to succeed. Now, the Tucson Intertribal House have a completely different situation. Most of these Indians have a history behind them that comes from American history. In the 1860s, all the way up until the early 1900s, there was such a thing as the Indian schools. And then the American government worked together with Christian organizations who, they didn't know, they had no idea what they were doing. They thought they were helping the Indians by giving them Christianity and by giving them Western values. They didn't realize they were destroying their cultures. But these groups, what can I say? They kidnapped children as young as 3, and they put them into Indian boarding schools that were run by the churches. And in those Indian boarding schools, the children were not allowed to see their families. They were not allowed to use their native languages. They weren't allowed to use any of their culture. They weren't allowed to wear their cultural clothing, and they weren't allowed to practice their religion. They had to practice Christianity. They had to wear Western clothes. They had to speak only English, and they were not allowed in any way to do anything that was un-Christian. Okay, and meanwhile they were taught some what were thought to be valuable skills. The girls were taught to be nannies and maids, and the boys were taught to be storekeepers and to take care of livestock. So then when they turned 18, they were let out of the Indian boarding schools, and they were put back into the reservation system. A lot of them couldn't even talk to their parents or their grandparents because they spoke only English, and their parents and grandparents only spoke their native tongue. So a lot of the Great Lakes Indians ended up losing their traditions during this time, and it was no fault of their own that they did. However, in the 1960s, a lot of those Indian schools were turned around and became places where Indians were trained in their traditions and their cultures. So they started teaching the languages back to the youngsters. They started teaching them their history, their culture, their religion, their native dress, and some of them really appreciated it. Most of them held on to Western values and Christianity, and some really irreversible things happened to the native people. All right, so now we have the native groups, the BIA Indians, quote unquote, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Indians, who are the Great Lakes team. They're holding on to their cards because they have to prove that they're Indians. They don't look Indian. They might have intermarried, or their parents or grandparents might have intermarried with non-Indians. So they're looking not so Indian, and the Tucson Intertribal House, who look, quote, very Indian. Okay, so the northern Indians are more likely to have their BIA cards because they constantly have to prove who they are. The Tucson Intertribal Indians don't have to prove who they are because they already know who they are. They look Indian, and a lot of them don't even have BIA cards, or they wouldn't carry them because who's going to challenge them? They look Indian, right? Except that the crowd is betting. They're placing bets on this game, and one way that they can win a lot of money is for all of them to bet on the Great Lakes tribe, and then for them to start a rumor that the Tucson Intertribal House are all Chicanos, and then ask them to produce the BIA cards, which of course means that they're going to win all their money back. But it also is very sad for the end of this particular short story.